Reckless street racers hit a homeless elderly woman. Then Morgan Freeman steps in. "Move it, old lady." The scream of tires echoed through the empty street as a sleek black McLaren swerved sharply, missing the old woman by mere inches. The impact wasn't direct, but it was enough. The metal cart she had been pushing flipped over, scattering tattered blankets, plastic bags, and a few dented cans across the pavement. The group of young street racers, 4 cars lined up under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, burst into laughter. Music blared from the speakers of a red Camaro, the bass vibrating through the ground. Derek Slater, the leader of the group, stepped out of his car, an arrogant smirk playing on his lips as he adjusted his designer jacket. "You really shouldn't be out here, Grandma," he taunted, striding toward the shaken woman who was struggling to get up. "This ain't exactly Beverly Hills." His crew laughed. Tyler, his closest friend and always the loudest, leaned against his Mustang, shaking his head. "Derek, man, I think you just gave her the ride of her life." More laughter, more amusement at someone else's misfortune. The woman, frail and shivering in the cold, reached out with trembling fingers to gather her things. Not a single one of them moved to help. Then, from the shadows, a voice, deep, steady, unshaken. "When did respect become optional?" The laughter stopped. Derek turned sharply toward the source of the voice, his smirk fading slightly. A man stepped forward, moving at a slow, deliberate pace. His presence alone shifted the energy in the air, commanding attention without effort. The flickering streetlight above cast long shadows on his face, but there was no mistaking him. "Morgan Freeman." Derek scoffed, crossing his arms. "And you are—" Morgan ignored the question, his gaze locked onto the old woman as she struggled to gather her scattered belongings. Without a word, he bent down and began picking them up, his hands careful, precise, showing a level of respect that no one else there had. Tyler rolled his eyes. "Come on, man, you're wasting your time. She probably doesn't even remember where she is." Morgan stood up slowly, meeting Tyler's gaze. "She remembers kindness. Do you? Is respect earned through power or character?" Comment 1 for character, 0 for power. The street fell silent. Even the distant hum of the city seemed to pause. Derek clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by some old man who thought he could play the hero. "Look, Grandpa," he said, stepping closer. "This is none of your business. We're just having fun. No harm, no foul." Morgan tilted his head slightly, studying him. "No harm?" he echoed. He gestured to the woman still kneeling on the pavement, still shaken. "She might disagree." Derek scoffed. "What, you want to give us a lecture? Maybe tell us a bedtime story while you're at it?" Morgan didn't smile. "No," he said simply. "I want you to listen. Because if you don't, you're about to learn a lesson the hard way." The streetlights flickered. The air grew heavier, and in that moment, Derek had no idea. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The street was dead silent except for the faint hum of neon signs flickering against the wet pavement. The scent of burnt rubber lingered in the air, mixing with the distant aroma of street food from a late-night food cart down the block. But here at this intersection, where 4 high-end sports cars had just screeched to a halt, there was nothing but tension. Derek Slater, the golden boy of street racing, stepped away from his McLaren, the glow of the city lights reflecting off the sleek black paint. His designer jacket hung loosely over his frame, and his platinum wristwatch gleamed under the dim light. To the world, he was a winner, a young, rich adrenaline junkie with more money than morals. And right now, he was thoroughly amused. The old woman lay on the pavement, still trying to comprehend what had happened. Her frail hands reached toward her belongings. Blankets, plastic bags, a half-crushed can of soup scattered across the street. Her cart, the only thing she owned, wobbled on its side, one of the wheels still spinning aimlessly. Derek smirked. "Damn, lady, you just walked straight into my lane. Maybe next time, watch where you're going." Behind him, his crew laughed. Tyler, his right-hand man, leaned against his Mustang, arms crossed. "Yo, you think she's okay? Or did you just upgrade her from homeless to hopeless?" More laughter. The woman groaned, struggling to lift herself, but her knees buckled beneath her. No one moved to help. Not the racers, not the bystanders who had peeked out from their apartments, half curious, half fearful. The world kept moving, and she remained invisible. Then, when did respect become optional? The voice came from the shadows, deep and measured. It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the night like a cold wind. Derek turned, frowning. "What the hell?" From the darkness, a figure stepped forward, slow, deliberate, carrying an air of authority that didn't need to be announced. He wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a long coat, slightly worn boots, and a simple old wristwatch. But the moment his face caught the light, there was no mistaking him. Morgan Freeman. Derek let out a scoff, crossing his arms. "And you are?" Morgan didn't answer. Instead, he walked past Derek, kneeling beside the woman, helping her sit up gently. His movements were precise, careful, as if treating her with anything less than dignity was unacceptable. Tyler rolled his eyes. "Come on, man, she's fine. I mean, she's still breathing, right?" Morgan stood, turning to face them, his gaze locked onto Tyler's. "She remembers kindness. Do you?" A hush fell over the group. Even the bass thumping from one of the cars seemed to fade into the background. Derek shifted, glancing at his crew before turning back to Morgan. "Listen, Grandpa," he said, his voice laced with forced confidence. "We didn't actually hit her, okay? She just got in the way. No harm, no foul." Morgan tilted his head slightly, observing him in that way only Morgan Freeman could, as if he was seeing straight through him. "No harm?" he repeated. Then he gestured toward the woman. "Tell me, do you think she would agree?" Derek's smirk twitched, but he held his ground. "Oh, so this is the part where you drop some wise words and try to make us feel guilty, huh?" He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "Newsflash, old man. This is just how the world works. Some people win, some people lose, and some people—" He glanced at the woman still trembling on the ground. "Some people were just never meant to be in the race." Morgan didn't react immediately. He let the words settle, let them echo in the night air. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "And yet, here you are, so desperate to prove that you're ahead, you don't even realize how lost you are." Derek's jaw clenched. His grip tightened on his car keys. Morgan took a step closer. "Let me ask you something, Derek." His voice was calm, steady. "How do you define winning?" Derek let out a humorless chuckle. "That's easy," he said, motioning to his car. "Fastest, richest, strongest. That's the only scoreboard that matters." Morgan nodded as if he had expected that answer. "And yet," he said, glancing at the woman, "you still don't have enough to buy respect." The words hit harder than Derek wanted to admit. He squared his shoulders, trying to shake off the sudden weight in his chest. "All right, listen up, old man," he said, voice sharper now. "You've had your fun, but this isn't some after-school special. You think one speech is going to change anything? You're wasting your time." Morgan studied him for a moment. "Maybe," he admitted, "or maybe for the first time in your life, someone is finally telling you the truth." Derek scoffed, turning back toward his car. "Yeah? And what truth is that?" Morgan's eyes never left him. "That you're not as untouchable as you think you are." The streetlights flickered. The night air grew heavier, and for the first time, Derek Slater felt something he wasn't used to. Doubt. Derek Slater had been challenged before by rival racers, by his father's expectations, by the occasional police chase. But this was different. Morgan Freeman wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't even angry. And yet Derek felt cornered. His fingers tightened around his car keys, the smooth metal digging into his palm. His crew was still watching, but something was off. Their smirks had faded. Their laughter had stopped. The usual arrogance, the easy confidence. They were waiting to see how he would respond. Derek scoffed, forcing a smirk. "So what? You think one speech is going to change anything? You think you can just walk up here, drop some life lesson, and suddenly we all have an epiphany?" Morgan tilted his head slightly, studying him with the same quiet intensity. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. Change doesn't happen in a moment, but it does start with one. Tyler let out an exaggerated groan, rolling his eyes. Jesus, man, this dude sounds like he walked straight out of a movie. Laughter rippled through the group, but it was forced, uneasy, like they were trying to convince themselves that this was still a joke. Morgan didn't react. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the old woman, still on the ground, still struggling to gather her things. Her frail hands shook as she reached for a can that had rolled into the gutter. Derek's smirk wavered. Morgan bent down, carefully retrieving the can and placing it in her hands. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Her eyes, weary and sunken, met his. She hesitated, then nodded. "I'm fine, son. Just takes me a little longer these days." Morgan smiled gently. "Take all the time you need." Derek swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. Something about watching him do that, about seeing someone so powerful, so respected, kneeling to help someone society had forgotten, felt wrong, like he should have been the one doing it. Morgan stood up, brushing off his coat. "The way you treat someone who has nothing to offer you, that's the real test of a man." Derek clenched his jaw. "You don't know anything about me," he shot back. Morgan's expression remained unchanged. "Then prove me wrong." Tyler laughed again, louder this time, desperate to break the tension. "Derek, man, are we really standing here debating ethics with Morgan freaking Freeman? Just get in the car. We've got a race to finish." Derek hesitated. His pride screamed at him to walk away, to laugh, to pretend this conversation never happened. But something was gnawing at him. He had spent his entire life measuring himself by speed, by dominance, by never backing down. But right now, standing under the dim glow of the streetlights, he didn't feel like the one in control. Morgan took a step closer, voice lowering just enough that only Derek could hear. "Tell me something, Derek. What happens when the race is over?" Derek frowned. "What?" "The cars get parked. The crowd goes home. The adrenaline fades. What's left?" Derek had no answer. Morgan continued. "You can outrun the police. You can outrun your father's disappointment. You can even outrun the guilt that's gnawing at you right now." He paused. "But you can't outrun yourself?" The words landed heavier than Derek expected. For the first time, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The street racing, the reckless stunts, the way he had built his reputation on making others feel small just so he could feel big. He had always thought respect was something you took, something you forced people to give you. But standing in front of Morgan Freeman, a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a single threat, and yet had commanded the entire street. Derek was starting to think he had it all wrong. Morgan took a slow step back, giving him space to make a decision. "You want to win, Derek? Then figure out what kind of man you want to be when the race is over." The street was silent. Even the distant sounds of the city felt muted. Derek swallowed hard, his fingers loosening around his car keys. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he even wanted to be in the driver's seat anymore. Derek Slater had never felt small, not in the racing scene, not in front of his father, not when facing cops who couldn't catch him, but standing here with Morgan Freeman's words still ringing in his ears, he felt something shift. His fingers fidgeted with the car keys in his hand. His crew was watching, waiting for his reaction. He could feel their eyes on him, expecting him to laugh it off, to toss another snide remark, to prove that nothing could touch him. But for the first time, he didn't want to. "You want to win, Derek? Then figure out what kind of man you want to be when the race is over." The words played on repeat in his mind. Morgan wasn't trying to embarrass him. He wasn't trying to make a scene, and that was the worst part. Derek could have brushed it off if it had been a fight, a challenge, something he could prove himself against. But this wasn't a fight. This was a mirror, and Derek didn't like what he saw in it. Tyler broke the silence, scoffing as he pushed off his car. "Derek, man, you're really just going to stand here listening to some old dude lecture you? What's next? You going to take up knitting and start volunteering at soup kitchens?" A few guys chuckled, but it was weak, forced. Even they could feel the shift. Derek finally spoke, but his voice lacked its usual bite. Man, shut up, Tyler blinked. What? Derek turned to face him. I said, shut up. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. Tyler frowned, looking around for backup, but the rest of the crew wasn't laughing anymore. Morgan stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. There it is. Derek looked at him, confused. There what is? The moment. Morgan nodded slightly. The moment you realize that listening doesn't make you weak, that thinking doesn't make you less of a man. Derek swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. For years, he had built himself up as the guy who never looked back, who never second-guessed, who never cared. But now he cared, and he didn't know what to do with that. Tyler, still clinging to the old dynamic, let out a bitter laugh. Oh, I get it now. Derek's finally gone soft. Derek clenched his jaw. Maybe I was just stupid before. That shut Tyler up. Morgan smiled slightly, but he didn't gloat. He didn't have to. Instead, he turned his attention back to the old woman who was still sitting on the curb, hugging her belongings close. Derek followed his gaze, and before he could even process what he was doing, he took a step forward, and then another. Then, in a move that stunned even himself, he crouched down and started picking up the scattered items: an old wool hat, a crumpled bag of crackers, a notebook so worn that the pages were barely holding together. He held them out to her. Here. The woman looked at him warily at first, as if she wasn't sure if this was another cruel joke, but when Derek didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't laugh, just waited, she reached out and took them. Thank you, she said softly. Derek nodded, standing up. Tyler made a disgusted noise. Are we seriously doing this right now? Derek shot him a look. You can leave if you want. Tyler stared at him for a long moment, then scoffed, shaking his head as he turned back toward his car. You're a joke, man. But no one followed him. The crew that had always been at Derek's side, that had always egged him on, stood frozen, some glancing at Tyler, some at Derek, unsure where to place their loyalty now that the lines had blurred. Morgan's voice broke through the tension. You know, he said, his tone thoughtful, some people spend their whole lives running, whether it's from the past, from responsibility, or from themselves. But the real test, he looked Derek in the eye, it's knowing when to stop. Derek exhaled, feeling the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. He was standing still, and for the first time that felt like a win. The city was never truly silent, but in this moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Derek Slater stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the old woman who had just thanked him. It was such a simple thing, just 2 words, but they carried more weight than he could have imagined. A part of him wanted to brush it off, to pretend this moment didn't mean anything, but the truth was, it did. Morgan Freeman was watching him, his expression unreadable but knowing. Tyler, still leaning against his car, let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Man, you are seriously letting some old guy and a homeless lady get in your head? Derek clenched his jaw. He was used to letting comments like that roll off his back. But this time, something about it irritated him. You don't get it, do you? Derek muttered. Tyler scoffed. Oh, I get it. You're catching feelings over some random street lecture. You gonna start preaching now, too? Derek turned to face him fully. No, man, you don't get it because you never stopped to think about anything. Ever. Tyler frowned. What the hell is that supposed to mean? It means, Derek said, his voice measured but firm, that maybe we're not as untouchable as we think we are. That maybe we don't get to just speed through life like nothing matters. A quiet fell over the crew. No one had ever heard Derek talk like this before. Not in all the years they had raced together, caused trouble together, laughed at everyone who wasn't them. And Tyler? Tyler hated it. Do whatever, he said, shaking his head. You want to waste your night playing social worker? Be my guest. I'm out. He pushed himself off the car, swinging open the driver's side door. Yeah, Derek called after him. And what happens when the next person we hit doesn't get back up? Tyler froze. Derek could see his shoulders tense, his grip tightening on the door handle. but he didn't turn around. He just let out a frustrated breath, climbed into his car, and peeled off down the street, tires screeching into the night. No one else moved. One by one, the rest of the crew exchanged uncertain glances, then silently climbed into their cars. They didn't leave like Tyler did, didn't gun their engines in some dramatic exit, but the message was clear. The old order was shifting. And Derek Slater, he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. Morgan stepped beside him, hands in his coat pockets. A strange feeling, isn't it? Derek huffed a quiet laugh. Yeah. Feels weird when nobody's laughing with you anymore. Morgan nodded. That's because they weren't laughing with you, Derek. They were laughing at everything else. Derek turned to face him. So what now? Morgan studied him for a moment before speaking. That depends, he said. You've spent your whole life running, trying to prove something. The question is, who are you trying to prove it to? Derek didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. The hum of distant traffic filled the silence. The streetlights buzzed overhead. The night air was cold, but for the first time, Derek wasn't rushing to escape it. Morgan exhaled as if sensing the weight of the moment. There's no shame in changing direction, kid, he said. The real shame is knowing you should and doing nothing. Derek nodded slowly. His McLaren sat there, engine off, waiting for him to make a choice. And for the first time, speeding away wasn't the answer. Derek Slater had spent his whole life believing that speed meant control. The faster you went, the less time you had to think. The less time you had to doubt yourself. The less time you had to care. But standing there on that cold street with Morgan Freeman's words still settling into his bones, Derek felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, maybe ever. Stillness. His crew was gone, leaving behind only the faint smell of burning rubber and the distant roar of Tyler's Mustang fading into the night. The old woman had managed to collect her belongings, clutching them close as she shuffled toward a quieter, safer corner of the city. And now it was just him and Morgan. So, Derek said, running a hand through his hair, this is the part where you tell me to turn my life around, right? Quit racing, become a model citizen, maybe start a book club? Morgan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. No, Derek. This is the part where I tell you that the next move is yours to make. Derek scoffed. Right. And what if I just get back in my car and keep doing what I've always done? Morgan studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. Then you'll keep getting what you've always gotten. The words hit deeper than Derek wanted to admit. He turned away, looking at his McLaren, the same car he had spent years worshiping, modifying, pushing to its absolute limit. It had always been his escape, his proof that he was somebody. But now it felt like just another machine. Morgan stepped beside him, gazing at the car. What's the fastest you've ever gone? Derek smirked slightly. You want an official number or the real one? Morgan chuckled. Give me the real one. 205, maybe 210. Depends on who you ask. Morgan nodded. And what did it feel like? Derek hesitated. Like I was untouchable. Like nothing could catch me. Morgan turned to face him fully. And yet here you are. Stopped. Derek exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. Yeah, well, guess even I can't outrun everything. Morgan nodded again as if that was the answer he had been waiting for. No one can, Derek. The real question is, what are you running from? Derek opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. Because he didn't know. Or maybe he just didn't want to say it out loud. The silence stretched between them, but Morgan didn't push. He just stood there, patient as ever, letting Derek wrestle with the truth in his own time. Finally, Derek let out a slow breath. So what now? Morgan smiled slightly. That's up to you. Derek looked down at his car one last time. For years, it had been his whole identity, the thing that made him feel alive, the thing that made him feel worth something. But tonight, for the first time, it felt like just a car. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, then, after a long pause, tossed them into Morgan's hands. Hold on to these for me. Morgan caught them effortlessly, his gaze warm but unreadable. For how long? Derek exhaled. Until I figure out what the hell I'm actually racing toward. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the only life he had ever known and stepping toward something new. Something real. Morgan Freeman watched as Derek walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the dim glow of the streetlights. The keys to the McLaren sat cool and still in the palm of his hand. He rolled them between his fingers, the metal catching the faint neon glow from a nearby sign. Most people thought speed meant freedom, that the faster you went, the further you could outrun your problems. But Derek Slater had just realized what few ever did. Sometimes stopping takes more courage than running. Morgan exhaled slowly, pocketing the keys. He wasn't sure if Derek would come back for them. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe never. That wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in his life, Derek wasn't letting his car decide who he was. Behind him, the street was quiet. The old woman had long since disappeared into the shadows, taking her cart and whatever little she had left with her. The city moved on just as it always did. Then, "So what, now you fix lost kids for a living?" Morgan turned slightly unsurprised to see Tyler standing by his car, arms crossed, the same cocky smirk plastered on his face. "Derek might be buying whatever wisdom you're selling, but I know better," Tyler continued, stepping closer. "People don't change. They just find new ways to pretend they're better than they are." Morgan studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You sound like a man who spent a lot of time pretending." Tyler's smirk faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly. "Yeah? Well, at least I'm honest about who I am." Morgan nodded, as if considering that. "And who is that exactly?" Tyler opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but no words came. Morgan smiled knowingly. "Thought so." Tyler scoffed, shaking his head. "You think you're real smooth, huh? Just walking around talking in riddles, making people doubt themselves? Newsflash, old man, I don't need your life lessons." Morgan didn't argue. He just shrugged. "Maybe not. But you're still here." Tyler clenched his jaw, looking away. The silence stretched between them. Morgan finally broke it. "Derek left those keys with me." Tyler's eyes flicked back to him. "Yeah? So?" "So," Morgan said, holding up the keys, "it's not about the car. It never was." Tyler scoffed again, but this time it lacked conviction. Morgan took a slow step forward, his voice quieter now. "You think I'm just here to fix lost kids, Tyler? Number, I'm here because I've seen too many men spend their whole lives running from themselves, and I know what happens when they never stop." Tyler swallowed hard, his grip tightening around his arms. "And what happens?" he muttered. Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "They crash." For the first time that night, Tyler didn't have anything to say. The neon lights flickered. A cold wind swept through the street. Somewhere in the distance, the roar of an engine echoed through the city. Tyler looked at the keys in Morgan's hand one last time. Then, without another word, he turned, climbed into his Mustang, and drove off into the night. Morgan stood there for a moment, listening to the sound fade into silence. He exhaled, shook his head slightly, then turned and started walking. There was always another road, another lost soul. And Morgan Freeman? He had all the time in the world. Tyler gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as his Mustang idled at a red light. The city stretched ahead of him, neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement, but for the first time he wasn't focused on the road. His mind replayed the last hour. The old woman trembling as she gathered her belongings, Derek tossing his car keys to Morgan, and worst of all, Morgan's words. "You think you're untouchable, but sooner or later you crash." Tyler had spent his life believing in one thing. Power belonged to those who took it. Speed meant dominance. Fear kept people in line. But tonight he had seen something different. Derek, the guy who had always been the fastest, the cockiest, the most reckless, had stopped. He had listened. And even though Tyler had laughed it off, even though he had driven away like it didn't matter, it did. Because deep down he wasn't sure who he was without the bravado, the recklessness, the noise. The light turned green, but Tyler didn't floor it like he usually would. Instead, he let out a breath and eased onto the gas. Behind him, back on that dimly lit street, Morgan Freeman watched the last of the racers disappear into the night. He had seen this before, the slow unraveling of arrogance, the quiet birth of something better. Some would get it, some wouldn't. But the real lesson? A man's worth isn't measured by how fast he goes, but by what he leaves behind when he finally stops. And tonight, for the first time, Derek Slater had finally stopped. Through this story, we realize that true power doesn't come from speed, wealth, or dominance. It comes from character. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn by the way you treat others, especially those who have nothing to offer you. It's easy to mock, to ignore, to pretend that someone else's struggle isn't your problem. But the real test of a person is how they act when no one is watching. When there's no crowd, no reward, no reason to be kind other than the fact that it's the right thing to do. Because in the end, life isn't about how fast you run. It's about who you become when the race is over.